December 7, 1941. The Pacific is aflame. Smoke billows over Pearl Harbor as Japanese carrier aircraft will back toward the horizon, leaving battleships smoldering in the shallow harbor waters. To Tokyo's admirals, this strike has crippled American sea power for years to come. They imagine a vast ocean, unbridgeable, locked under the rising sun. Yet even as the oil slicks burn on Oahu's waters, something far quieter, far less glamorous, is stirring on the American mainland. By the time Japan's fleet sails again, the world's largest industrial engine will be shifting gears, and its heartbeat will be measured not in aircraft carriers or battleships, but in the slow, steady thrum of cargo hulls being hammered into existence. What the Japanese could not yet comprehend was that their boldest gamble would soon be undone not by warlords or admirals, but by the relentless tide of steel merchantmen America called Liberty ships that on the docks of Portland, Baltimore, and New Orleans. Factories that had once built automobiles, refrigerators, and even toys began to awaken into something altogether new. Welding torches replaced hand tools. Riveters hammered in endless shifts. From frozen Great Lakes yards to the warm Gulf, America was about to perform an act no empire in history had achieved before. It would mass-produce the very arteries of war. Day and night, under the watch of floodlights, steel plates rose like skeletal ribs into the shape of ships. Sparks fell in showers, echoing like strange fireworks as hull after hull was stitched together. Where Japan believed geography was its strongest ally, the United States was quietly rewriting geography itself, building a bridge of ships across the Pacific for the Japanese High Command. The Pacific was not merely water, it was a fortress and shield. They counted on distance. A voyage from California to the Philippines meant weeks at sea. Convoys would be vulnerable, supply lines stretched. The Americans will not stomach such losses, Japanese planners told themselves. Yet even as Japanese cruisers prowled the waters, a new kind of enemy was being born, not elegant, not glamorous, but unstoppable. The Liberty ship was not designed to win beauty contests. It was designed to appear faster than the enemy could sink it. Imagine the confusion aboard a Japanese submarine crewed by veterans of China's coastal wars. Through the periscope lens, they see smoke on the horizon, another convoy heading west. They dive, line up their torpedoes, and fire. An American freighter erupts in a column of flame. Men scramble into lifeboats. For a moment, there is satisfaction. Another enemy ship erased. But the very next dawn, another convoy steams across the same horizon. Then another, and another. To those watching from periscopes and island outposts, it seemed impossible. They believed America must be disguising warships as merchants, must be bluffing, and must be hiding some secret reserve. What they did not grasp was far simpler and far more terrifying. The United States was outbuilding destruction itself. Each Liberty ship was a paradox, slow, ungainly, and prone to creaking and groaning in rough seas. But they were also miracles of speed, not in knots, but in their birth. A battleship might take years. An aircraft carrier, many months. But a Liberty ship? 40 days. 30 days. In one extraordinary case, a shipyard launched one in less than 5. What had once been a craft built by artisans had become an assembly line product, as replaceable as a light bulb, as standardized as a rifle cartridge. American factories, harnessed to a single design, turned these hulking freighters into a flood. The Pacific Campaign was not simply an island struggle. It was a battle of logistics stretched over thousands of miles. Japan's admirals calculated tonnage the way generals once counted divisions. Their strategy depended on attrition, sink faster than America could replace. Yet they had never faced an opponent who treated the very idea of attrition as irrelevant. For every ship lost to a submarine or bomber, another would soon slide down the slipways. Like ants rebuilding a crushed mound overnight. America's yards erased defeat with steel. The Liberty ship was 441 feet of welded steel, 56 feet across, with a deadweight capacity of more than 10,000 tons. Inside her cavernous holds, tanks, trucks, fuel, ammunition, and food filled every corner. Cranes swung overhead, loading everything from locomotives to mules. They were not elegant warships. They were the arteries without which no fleet could live. Marines storming Tarawa, sailors patrolling Guadalcanal. Pilots launching from carriers. Every bullet, every gallon of fuel, every sack of rice they consumed had crossed an ocean inside the belly of a Liberty ship. Now picture the growing unease inside the Japanese Imperial Navy. Reports trickle in from submarine captains. Enemy convoys numerous. Difficult to reduce. From air bases in Rabaul and Truk, reconnaissance pilots sketch endless wakes stretching toward the horizon. And still the attacks fail to dent the flow. Japan's officers, schooled in Mahan's doctrines of decisive battle, cannot comprehend a war fought as a battle of factories. To them, ships are symbols of prestige, forged with ceremony, crude by hand-picked men. To America, ships are products, tools, and consumables. One admiral later remarked, "It was as if we fought against a tide." Night after night, across the shipyards, welders in leather aprons worked until their eyes ached. Women with kerchiefs wrapped around their hair, men too old for the front but too proud to stand idle, and immigrants barely speaking English. All became shipwrights. They worked through holidays, through winters, and through exhaustion. The Japanese thought America was soft, unwilling to endure. Yet here, on the banks of the Mississippi, on the coast of California, ordinary Americans labored with a desperation as fierce as any soldier's courage. The war in the Pacific would stretch across atolls and jungles, seas and skies. But its lifeblood pulsed from Liberty ships. In dim-lit wheelhouses, civilian merchant mariners, often unarmed, guided their lumbering vessels across submarine-infested waters. They braved storms, mines, and the silent predators lurking beneath the waves. Many went down with their ships, yet the flow never ceased. Day after day, week after week, Liberty ships stitched the Pacific into something Japan had sworn could never exist, an American supply highway, stretching unbroken from San Francisco to Manila. For Japanese commanders, disbelief hardened into dread. Their own merchant fleet shrank under relentless attack. Tankers burned, and freighters sank. Every convoy was precious, every loss irreplaceable. And across the same ocean, their enemy treated ships as though they were leaves blown from trees. Always another ready to fall, always another sprouting in its place. The Pacific's vastness, once Japan's greatest weapon, had been turned against them in this silent duel of tonnage. One truth emerged: battleships could dominate headlines, carriers could decide campaigns. But it was the Liberty ship that determined whether those campaigns could even be fought. And though they looked like little more than floating warehouses, each one carried within its steel bones a promise that America would not be starved, that its armies would not be stranded, and that Japan's dream of an impregnable ocean fortress was already doomed. By early 1942, the Pacific had become a vast chessboard of uncertainty. Japan's empire stretched in a crimson arc from the jungles of Burma to the coral atolls of the Marshall Islands. The rising sun flag flew over Hong Kong, Singapore, and Manila. In Tokyo, the high command believed they had achieved what no empire before them had dared: domination of the Pacific's expanse. To their eyes, America was reeling, disoriented, its fleet broken at Pearl Harbor, its forward bases in flames. Japanese officers calculated not in months, but in years. Years of consolidation before the United States could recover. They underestimated the industrial heartbeat that was already quickening in the American homeland. For while Japan celebrated victories, a storm of steel was forming in the foundries and shipyards of the United States. Franklin Roosevelt had spoken of making America the arsenal of democracy, but few in Tokyo understood what those words would mean in practice. They envisioned a slow crawl of shipbuilding, limited by manpower and constrained by skill. What they did not account for was the transformation of American industry itself. Assembly lines that had produced cars now stamped out steel plates. Women who once sewed garments now welded seams. A society that seemed fragmented and soft to Japanese planners was in fact coiling like a spring, ready to unleash its strength. The strategic situation was stark. Japan's navy had trained for decisive battles, grand fleet clashes in the style of Tsushima. Their doctrine emphasized overwhelming strikes, brilliant maneuvers, and sudden hammer blows. In the short term, this worked. The United States Navy, deprived of battleships, shifted desperately to carriers and submarines. But beyond the headlines of Midway and Guadalcanal, there was a quieter war being waged, the war of logistics. This was not a duel of admirals, but of tonnage, supply, and replacement. And in that war, the Liberty ship became the secret weapon. The Japanese war machine depended on fragile lifelines. They required oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, and tin and bauxite from across their new empire. Yet Japan's merchant fleet was small, barely adequate even in peacetime. Each loss was a wound that did not heal. American submarines began to strangle these lifelines, sinking tankers and freighters by the hundreds. By 1945, the Japanese merchant fleet would be virtually annihilated. In contrast, America's answer to losses was startling: build more. Where Japan struggled to replace even a handful of ships, America launched thousands. This doctrine mismatch was profound. Japan believed distance and attrition would shield its conquests. The Pacific Ocean, after all, was not a mere channel but a moat wider than anything in history. Supply lines from California to Australia stretched over 6,000 miles. To feed armies on Guadalcanal or New Guinea seemed, by Japanese reckoning, impossible. Yet the Liberty ship rendered those calculations obsolete. It was not fast, it was not beautiful, but it was many. Each hull sliding into the water was a blow struck against the very concept of distance. The Allies had understood this even before Pearl Harbor. Britain's survival in the Battle of the Atlantic depended on convoying merchant ships through wolf packs of U-boats. The United States had studied these lessons. When war came, America did not build ships as individuals. It built them as a flood. By 1943, Japanese commanders began to notice something alarming. No matter how many convoys they struck, the enemy's supply lines thickened rather than thinned. Reports described inexhaustible reinforcements and endless convoys. What they were witnessing was not a mirage but the full force of American industrial mobilization. A broader war situation turned around this quiet revolution. In the South Pacific, General MacArthur's forces pushed northward, island hopping from base to base. Each step demanded staggering amounts of supplies: food for soldiers, shells for artillery, fuel for aircraft, and spare parts for vehicles. Without Liberty ships, such campaigns would have been fantasy. In the Central Pacific, Admiral Nimitz plotted his advance toward the Marianas and eventually Japan itself. Carriers might deliver the blows, but Liberty ships delivered the lifeblood. Their steel holds carried the invisible weight of victory. Beans, bullets, and bandages. By 1943, Japan's doctrine began to show cracks. The decisive battle never materialized. Instead, they faced a slow tightening noose. Every island bypassed, every airstrip built, and every convoy delivered by Liberty ships chipped away at their empire. Their calculations had not accounted for an opponent who could cross oceans daily, as though distance had ceased to matter. Japanese officers who once mocked American weakness now whispered in disbelief. How can they sustain this? The answer lay not in the admiral's strategies, but in Detroit's factories, Pittsburgh's steel mills, and Portland's shipyards. Even within the United States, the scale of the effort was staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, more than 2,700 Liberty ships would be launched. Never in history had so many cargo ships been built in so little time. The feat dwarfed even the most ambitious shipbuilding programs of other nations. Japan had no answer. Each convoy steaming westward was another reminder that their war plans rested on sand. The Pacific theater, often portrayed through the drama of aircraft carriers and bloody amphibious assaults, was in truth a contest of endurance. Japan's strategy, built on shock and awe, could not compete with America's endurance of steel. Liberty ships embodied that endurance. They did not win battles directly, but they made battles winnable. They were the invisible line in every after-action report, the unmentioned factor in every victory. By the midpoint of the war, Tokyo's commanders were beginning to grasp the scale of their miscalculation. Attrition, the weapon they had trusted, was no longer on their side. The Pacific was no longer a barrier. It was becoming an American highway, patrolled daily by convoys of steel. What they once believed impossible was now routine. In the end, the historical context of the Liberty ship reveals something larger than ships themselves. It reveals the transformation of modern war. No longer was victory decided solely by battlefield brilliance or naval gunnery. Victory was forged in factories, delivered by freighters, and sustained by tonnage. The Japanese command could not see this clearly until it was too late. Their empire, stretched thin and starved of supplies, collapsed not only under the bombs of B-29s or the guns of Marines, but under the weight of a simple truth. America could outbuild their destruction in the months after Pearl Harbor. The Japanese High Command studied reports with growing confusion. Their submarines had sunk American freighters by the dozens, and their aircraft had strafed convoys from New Guinea to the Aleutians, yet the enemy's flow of supplies seemed undiminished. Every time an oil tanker exploded in fire or a transport vanished beneath the waves, another ship appeared to take its place. Tokyo's admirals debated in hushed tones. Was America hiding some reserve fleet? Had Britain secretly transferred hundreds of merchantmen to the Pacific? Or was there something else, some hidden factor they could not yet grasp? The secret was not mystical. It was mechanical. In early 1941, even before America entered the war, President Roosevelt had demanded 50,000 planes a year and thousands of cargo ships to sustain them. To meet that demand, engineers had stripped away the mystique of shipbuilding and transformed it into something as repeatable as making cars. The result was the Liberty ship, a vessel born not of tradition but of pragmatism. On paper, the design looked almost laughably plain. A standardized hull, simple reciprocating steam engines, outdated by naval standards. A speed of barely 11 knots. To naval officers raised on sleek cruisers and powerful battleships, they looked like relics. But what the Japanese never understood, until it was too late, was that their very simplicity was the source of their power. These ships could be built anywhere, by anyone, with parts that could be manufactured by the thousands. Where a Japanese freighter required skilled craftsmen and long months of work, a Liberty ship required only steel, welders, and time measured in weeks. In Germany, U-boat captains received glowing reports of tonnage war successes in the Atlantic. Every Liberty ship they torpedoed was celebrated as a triumph. But even as hulls cracked under explosions, new ones slid down the slipways. American propaganda posters shouted, "A ship a day keeps Hitler away." For Japan, the message was even more terrifying. A ship a day meant that attrition, the very strategy they had banked on, was meaningless. The hidden advantage went deeper than numbers. It was not only the ships but also the system behind them. Each Liberty ship carried radios, charts, and convoy schedules, all coordinated across oceans. America's communication networks linked shipyards to admirals, admirals to convoys, and convoys to forward bases. While Japanese officers fought with the assumption of scarcity, American logisticians operated as if abundance were their natural state. When a Liberty ship vanished beneath the waves, its cargo was already on another, its replacement already under construction, and its loss already calculated into the plan. It was war by mathematics, war by production quotas, and war that nullified traditional notions of victory at sea. In Tokyo's naval staff rooms, younger officers whispered that the enemy was cheating fate. Reports described convoys arriving in Australia weekly, even daily, loaded with fuel, trucks, and aircraft. Japanese commanders dismissed some of these ace exaggerations. But as 1942 turned to 1943, the reality became undeniable. The Americans were crossing the Pacific not occasionally, not cautiously, but relentlessly. For Japanese submariners, the experience was maddening. They would sink a freighter, risk depth charges, and escape to report their triumph, only to find that their kill had changed nothing. New convoys kept coming, as if their torpedoes had struck ghosts. It was a psychological war as much as a logistical one. Japan's warriors felt as though they were fighting an enemy with infinite lives, like striking shadows that always returned. The Liberty ship was the quiet answer to Japan's great gamble. It was not glamorous, not heroic in appearance. Its crews, often civilian mariners, did not wear dress uniforms or march in parades. Yet every one of those vessels carried within its holds the hidden advantage of the Allies, the certainty that distance and attrition could no longer decide the war. What Japan could not see, what its admirals could not bring themselves to admit, was that they had miscalculated the very essence of modern war. They believed in decisive fleet actions, in thunderous clashes that would shatter morale. But the war in the Pacific was not a single duel of fleets. It was a daily grind, measured not in victories but in tonnage landed. And in that grind, The Liberty ship was supreme. Each hull represented more than steel and cargo. It represented the collapse of the Pacific's natural defense. What had once been an oceanic barrier was now a bridge of steel plates and steam engines, stretching relentlessly toward Tokyo, Japan's high command, so certain that America lacked the resolve to sustain a distant war, watched in disbelief as Liberty ships proved them wrong, day after day. Crossing waters they thought uncrossable, the hidden advantage was revealed not in secret technology, not in brilliant tactics, but in something far simpler and more terrifying, an enemy that refused to run out of ships. The Liberty ship was more than a freighter. It was an engineering paradox, crude yet ingenious, fragile yet unstoppable. At 441 feet long and displacing more than 14,000 tons when fully loaded, it looked squat and ungainly against the sleek silhouettes of destroyers and cruisers. But beneath that ordinary hull lay a revolution in shipbuilding, one that would shatter Japan's faith in distance and attrition. At its heart was the triple expansion steam engine, a design that already seemed obsolete in the 1940s. Producing about 2,500 horsepower, it could push the ship only to 11 knots, barely faster than a man on a bicycle. To Japanese naval officers, who revered speed and maneuverability, it seemed almost laughable. Yet that outdated engine was precisely why the Liberty ship could be built in the thousands. It used parts that could be manufactured by companies across the American Midwest, piston rods forged in Chicago, boilers cast in Ohio, and condensers assembled in Detroit. No exotic alloys, no precision machining, just reliable, interchangeable components churned out like spark plugs. The hull, too, was a departure from tradition, where Japanese and European shipyards still relied on riveted plates, painstakingly hammered by skilled craftsmen. American yards embraced welding. Entire steel plates were fused edge to edge, a process that demanded far less labor and could be taught to novices in weeks. The result was faster, cheaper construction. Welding carried risks. In icy waters, some Liberty ships cracked in two without warning, their hull seams splitting under stress. But the solution was not to halt production, it was to build more. America treated failure not as a catastrophe, but as data, feeding lessons back into the assembly line. Inside, the ship was a cavern of practicality. 5 cargo holds could swallow tanks, jeeps, and artillery pieces by the dozens. Ammunition was stacked like bricks, fuel drums lashed into place. A Liberty ship could carry 9,000 tons of cargo, enough to sustain an entire division for days of combat. Its deck cranes allowed loading and unloading at primitive ports, from Australian harbors to half-finished piers on Pacific atolls. Every detail was designed for utility. The statistics told the story. More than 2,700 Liberty ships were built between 1941 and 1945. At the height of production, one slid into the water every 2 or 3 days. The record was astonishing. The SS Robert E. Peary assembled in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at the Kaiser Shipyard in Richmond, California. Japanese officers who studied such figures could scarcely believe them. In their world, a freighter took months, even years, to complete. How could a nation erase losses faster than they were inflicted? The Liberty ship was not just a vessel, it was a lesson in scale. Each weighed nearly 7,000 tons empty, yet its cost was little more than $2 million at the time, the equivalent of a single bomber squadron. Its standardized design, known as the EC2S C1, allowed blueprints to be shared across dozens of yards. Henry J. Kaiser, a construction magnate, pioneered modular methods. Sections of the ship were prefabricated inland, shipped by rail, and welded together at coastal yards. This was not shipbuilding as art. It was shipbuilding as mass production, as ruthless and efficient as turning out automobiles. And then there were the men and women behind them. By 1943, more than 600,000 workers toiled in shipyards across the United States. Housewives became welders, farmhands became crane operators, and teenagers guided steel plates into place. Posters called them soldiers of the home front. Their output was measured in hull numbers rather than medals, but their impact was just as decisive. Each whistle of a launched Liberty ship was another blow against the Axis. Another reminder that America's strength lay not only in its armies but also in its factories. For the Japanese, these numbers were terrifying. Their own merchant fleet had begun the war with just over 6 million tons of capacity. By 1945, relentless American submarine and air attacks would reduce that to a trickle. Tankers burned in the East China Sea, coal ships sank off Formosa, and convoys vanished under the waves. And while Japan struggled to replace a handful of ships, America produced tens of thousands of tons of new cargo space every week. The balance was not merely shifting, it was collapsing. Even the ship's defenses reflected its dual nature of vulnerability and resilience. Armed with a 3-inch bow gun, a 4-inch stern gun, and a scattering of anti-aircraft weapons, Liberty ships could fend off aircraft or harassing submarines, but were never meant to fight pitched battles. Their real defense was their numbers. No single Liberty ship was indispensable. Sink one, and its cargo might be lost, but the convoy would press on, and another hull would soon take its place. It was the logic of redundancy, a logic alien to Japanese commanders, who saw ships as national treasures rather than expendable tools. The engineering brilliance of the Liberty ship lay not in elegance, but in philosophy. It asked, what is the minimum we need to cross an ocean and deliver supplies? Strip away everything else. Make it cheap. Make it fast. Make it replaceable. The result was a vessel that could be dismissed as crude by naval purists, yet proved more decisive than the most advanced warships afloat. When Japanese intelligence officers pored over captured reports, they were struck by the scale. Factories in Pittsburgh rolled out steel plate by the acre. Railroads carried prefabricated sections to shipyards like clockwork. Yard cranes swung into motion day and night. A Liberty ship was not the triumph of a single engineer or yard. It was the triumph of an entire nation's industrial machine. By the time Japan recognized the truth, it was too late. The technical specifications, the tonnage, the horsepower, the weld seams, were not mere numbers. They were the embodiment of a doctrine Japan had never anticipated, that in the modern age, victory belonged not to the fastest ship or the most skilled crew, but to the side that could build faster than the enemy could destroy. September 1944. The rolling fields of Lorraine in eastern France are soaked with autumn rain. Fog clings to the low ground, turning hedgerows into ghostly silhouettes. Across the muddy plains near the village of Ericourt, the rumble of engines grows into a thunderous chorus. German Panthers, sleek and deadly, prowl forward, their commanders certain that another ambush will cripple the advancing Americans. For years, the Wehrmacht has trusted its armor to dominate open terrain. Yet on this battlefield, the Germans are about to encounter something far stranger than tanks, a weapon of endurance. A logistical leviathan whose power cannot be seen in the flash of a cannon, but in the endless convoys that sustain the fight, behind the American armored divisions pressing through Lorraine. Liberty ships were the silent giants keeping them alive. Weeks earlier, in ports as distant as New York and New Orleans, these hulking freighters had been loaded to their steel bones. Jeeps and half-tracks lashed to their decks, shells packed in wooden crates, barrels of fuel stacked like dominoes. Then, across the Atlantic, they came in endless convoys, braving U-boat wolf packs and Luftwaffe bombers. By the time the Panthers reached Ericourt, every Sherman tank facing them had been fueled, armed, and supplied because Liberty ships had delivered their lifeblood. But it was not only in Europe that their presence was decisive. Thousands of miles away, on the shattered coral of Tarawa, Marines clawed at the beaches under withering fire in November 1943. The lagoon was choked with wrecked landing craft, the air thick with smoke. Yet as the battle raged, Liberty ships lay offshore, their cranes swinging relentlessly, unloading ammunition and food onto waiting barges. Day after day, under sniper fire and shell bursts, the flow did not stop. For the men fighting yard by bloody yard, it seemed impossible that such vast quantities of supplies could keep reaching them. And yet they did, because Liberty ships had delivered them across a Pacific Japan believed uncrossable. Guadalcanal offered another lesson. In late 1942, Japanese naval forces sought to strangle the Marines holding Henderson Field. Every night, the Tokyo Express roared down the slot, delivering troops and shells under cover of darkness. But the Express could never match America's logistical tide. Liberty ships, escorted by destroyers, ran supplies into the embattled island with mechanical regularity. Japanese cruisers might pounce and submarines might strike, but still the convoys arrived. Each delivery sustained the Marines just long enough for the tide to turn. The Imperial Navy could win night battles. It could not stop an ocean of steel freighters. Perhaps the most dramatic demonstration came in the Central Pacific Campaign. When Admiral Nimitz launched his thrust toward the Marianas in 1944, he required more than warships and aircraft. He needed floating warehouses to cross 3,000 miles of ocean and keep tens of thousands of men alive. Liberty ships provided exactly that. At Saipan and Guam, as Marines stormed the beaches, Liberty ships anchored in the turquoise waters beyond the reefs, disgorging tanks, artillery, and rations in an unbroken stream. The Japanese defenders fought to the death, but their courage could not halt the flow of supplies. The Americans advanced not only with rifles in their hands but also with the assurance that tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that, more Liberty ships would arrive. Even in the most dangerous waters, their presence was unshakable. In Leyte Gulf, October 1944, as the largest naval battle in history erupted, convoys of Liberty ships threaded their way through the chaos. Kamikazes screamed down from the sky, setting decks ablaze. Torpedoes streaked through the waves. Yet for every Liberty ship lost, 3 more followed behind. In one convoy, a freighter split in half from a torpedo blast, its stern sinking within minutes. But the bow section, still afloat, was lashed to a tug and hauled onward. Its cargo of shells was delivered to the front. Such resilience was both absurd and inspiring. The very image of America's determination. German intelligence officers studying the Battle of Aricourt were baffled. Their Panthers had the thicker armor, the longer guns, and the veteran crews. Yet the Americans fought with a confidence that seemed unnatural. Even when tanks were knocked out, replacements arrived within days. Even when fuel was burned at prodigious rates, fresh supplies flowed from depots that never seemed empty. After-action reports muttered about inexhaustible resources. What the Germans were really witnessing was the invisible hand of Liberty ships, feeding the front from across an ocean. For Japan, the experience was even more crushing. Their submarines prowled the Pacific, striking at convoys with deadly precision. Yet no matter how many ships they sank, the American tide never slackened. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese officers reviewed reports with disbelief. The enemy has landed again. Their convoys are without number. The Liberty ships had turned the Pacific into an American highway. Each convoy a moving declaration that Japan's strategy of attrition was broken. One Japanese officer captured in 1944 confessed his bewilderment. We destroyed their ships. We saw them burning. But the next week, more arrived. Where did they come from? His interrogators gave the answer. From shipyards that built faster than his navy could sink. From factories that never slept. From a nation that understood war not as a clash of fleets, but as a contest of endurance. In every major battle, from the hedgerows of France to the coral reefs of the Pacific, Liberty ships were the silent partners in victory. They did not fire the decisive shots. They did not storm the beaches, but they ensured that others could. Without them, tanks would have run dry, soldiers would have gone hungry, and airfields would have gone silent. With them, the Allies advanced relentlessly. Each campaign fueled by the unglamorous but unstoppable freighters that Japan could neither match nor comprehend. By 1944. The psychological toll of the Liberty ship was etched into the minds of Japanese commanders. They had trained their entire careers on doctrines of decisive battle, on the notion that one brilliant strike could break an enemy's back. Yet against America's logistical tide, such strikes seemed meaningless. Sink one freighter, and 2 more arrived. Bomb a convoy, and the flow did not falter. To the Japanese, it felt like fighting a phantom opponent, one that could never be exhausted, one that refused to vanish. Reports circulated through Tokyo's naval headquarters describing endless American convoys streaming toward the Central Pacific. Submarine captains wrote of torpedoes launched and hits confirmed, only to return weeks later to find the same routes clogged with fresh hulls. It is as though the sea itself delivers them, one commander lamented. Attrition, once Japan's shield, had turned into a source of despair. Instead of weakening the Americans, each attack underscored their resilience. The impact rippled far beyond tonnage. American troops began to feel a quiet confidence that set them apart from their enemy. On Guadalcanal, soldiers joked bitterly about hunger during the early months, but once Liberty ship convoys arrived regularly, their outlook shifted. They knew that even if today's rations were thin, more were coming. At Tarawa and Saipan, Marines fought with the assurance that behind them lay an endless ocean highway. Food, ammunition, replacements, everything they needed would not run dry. That knowledge was as powerful as any weapon. It hardened morale, sustained momentum, and gave commanders the freedom to plan operations without fearing the collapse of supply. For the Japanese soldier, the experience was the opposite. Convoys meant life, but Japan's merchant fleet was shrinking under relentless submarine assault. Units in New Guinea went weeks without resupply, starving in the jungle. Airfields in the Marianas ran out of aviation fuel, grounding planes before a single sortie could be flown. Soldiers scavenged for food in abandoned villages. Ammunition was hoarded so tightly that rifles were carried into battle with only a handful of rounds. The contrast was stark. Americans fought with abundance, while Japanese forces dwindled into isolation and hunger. Even Japan's officers began to feel the creeping hopelessness. They could not rotate units swiftly, could not reinforce garrisons, and could not replenish losses. Every decision was haunted by scarcity. Should they send fuel to a forward airbase or to a convoy of destroyers? Should they feed a garrison or supply an armored division? In every choice, something critical was abandoned. In America's war rooms, by contrast, planners spoke in millions of tons, allocating resources with confidence that Liberty ships would deliver. The psychological divide extended to the seas themselves. For American merchant mariners, the Liberty ship was both a prison and a lifeline. Convoys were tense. Days were spent scanning horizons for periscopes, and nights were interrupted by sudden alarms. Many ships went down in fire and oil, their crews vanishing into the waves. Yet replacements never stopped volunteering, driven by patriotism, duty, or sheer necessity of work. The mariners understood the stakes. Every cargo delivered meant lives saved on the front. Their endurance under constant threat became a quiet backbone of Allied victory. For the Japanese submarine crews, the story was darker. They stalked convoys with skill and bravery, striking true, but the results were hollow. Each kill failed to alter the course of war. Crews began to feel that their sacrifices were wasted, that they were gnawing at an enemy too vast to wound. Morale faltered. The Imperial Navy had sent its best men into the depths, but their triumphs dissolved in the face of America's industrial tide. Strategically, the Liberty ship reshaped entire campaigns. At Leyte, where the Philippines became the stage for Japan's desperate gamble, American forces sustained an invasion force of hundreds of thousands across an ocean. Japan threw nearly every remaining ship into the battle, yet even as surface fleets clashed, convoys of Liberty ships poured into Leyte Gulf. No amount of valor could compete with that. In Tokyo, senior officers debated whether America possessed some secret reservoir of shipping. The truth, that the United States simply built faster than Japan could sink, was almost too humiliating to accept. The psychological effect deepened as the war dragged on. In the final years, Japanese garrisons across the Pacific withered into starvation. At Rabaul, once a formidable bastion, soldiers dug roots from the earth to survive. At isolated atolls, troops surrendered not after battles, but after months without food. The Liberty ship, by ensuring American abundance, had created Japanese famine. This contrast eroded morale at every level, from soldier to admiral. Even among civilians, the consequences were devastating. As America's submarines strangled the home islands, Japanese families went hungry, factories stalled for lack of raw materials, and the war effort shrank into desperation. Meanwhile, in America, newspapers celebrated the launch of yet another Liberty ship, christened with champagne and cheered by shipyard workers. The psychological message was unmistakable. One nation was collapsing under scarcity. The other was drowning its enemies in steel and supplies that in the end, the Liberty ship's greatest victory was not on the battlefield, but in the minds of those who fought. It gave American soldiers faith, commanders freedom, and enemies despair. It turned Japan's strongest weapon, distance, into a weakness. And it proved that in modern war, psychology and logistics were intertwined. that abundance could crush morale as surely as firepower. The Japanese commanders who once believed America was soft and hesitant now understood the truth. Their empire was bleeding not only from bombs and bullets, but also from the silent certainty that no matter what they destroyed, more would always come. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the shattered remnants of Japan's empire stretched across a Pacific littered with wreckage. Burned-out hulks rusted in lagoons, submarines lay entombed beneath the waves, and island garrisons wasted away in hunger. Yet threading through the smoke of history was an undeniable truth. The war had been won not only by fleets and armies, but also by the humble Liberty ship that in Washington and London. Military analysts pored over reports with sober clarity. They realized that the Liberty ship had not simply been a vessel. It had been the backbone of a new kind of warfare. It had proven that industrial mass production could overcome distance, that standardized steel hulls could topple empires. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, at Nuremberg, spoke bitterly of Germany's defeat. "We built better tanks, but you built tanks that worked together." The same was true at sea. Japan had built warships of elegance and power, but America built ships that worked together, convoys that multiplied endlessly, and supply lines that could not be severed. The legacy of the Liberty ship stretched beyond World War II. Many of the freighters survived, their holds later filled with grain instead of bullets, with migrants instead of Marines. They became symbols of transition, vessels that had once fed war and now feeding peace. Some remained in service into the 1960s and beyond, proof of their rugged utility. Others rusted away in harbors, monuments to a time when sheer numbers had outweighed elegance. But the greater legacy was doctrinal. The lesson echoed into the Cold War: logistics is destiny. In Korea, in Vietnam, and in the Gulf War, American commanders planned not only for divisions and carriers, but also for the invisible fleets of supply ships that would sustain them. The concept of network-centric warfare, forces connected, supplied, and coordinated across continents, owed its roots to the Liberty ship convoys of the 1940s. Modern sealift commands, capable of moving divisions across oceans in days, stand as descendants of those welded freighters. For Japan, the memory was bitter. Admirals who once preached decisive battle admitted their error. One reflected, years later, "We never understood that the Americans fought a different war. For us, a ship was a jewel. For them, it was a tool." That cultural divide had doomed an empire. The Liberty ship had stripped away the romance of naval warfare and revealed its new soul: industry, speed, and replacement. There was also a human legacy. The shipyard workers, men and women who labored in heat and cold, who welded until their hands shook, who sent steel hulls sliding into the water with names painted fresh on the bow, were as much warriors as the Marines on Iwo Jima. They proved that courage could take many forms, not only in charging a beach under fire, but also in rising before dawn to build another freighter, knowing it might never return, but also knowing it was essential. Their work demonstrated the unity of a nation at war. The Liberty ship also taught a universal lesson about modern conflict. Strength is no longer measured solely by firepower or brilliance of command. It is measured by endurance, by the ability to supply men thousands of miles away, and by the willingness to treat ships as expendable so that soldiers are not. In this sense, the Liberty ship was both brutal and beautiful. Brutal in its disposability, beautiful in its relentless purpose. Today, a handful of Liberty ships remain preserved as floating museums. Visitors walk their steel decks, peer into cavernous holds, and listen to the whisper of history in creaking bulkheads. They seem plain, almost boring, beside the silhouettes of battleships or carriers. But for those who know their story, the sight is humbling. These were the vessels that carried victory on their backs. These were the ships the Japanese could never believe were crossing the Pacific daily, until it was too late. The decades pass. The lesson remains. Power is not in the weapon that strikes hardest, but in the system that strikes longest. Japan learned that truth in fire and famine. America proved it in steel and supply. The Liberty ship was more than a freighter. It was the embodiment of industrial will. A floating promise that the United States would never run out, never be starved, and never surrender the ocean highways. And so the story closes where it began, with disbelief. In 1942, Japanese commanders could not fathom how America crossed the Pacific every day. By 1945, they knew the answer. It was not mystery, not magic, not hidden reserves. They were Liberty ships, thousands of them, ordinary yet extraordinary, slow yet unstoppable, crude yet decisive. They turned the tide of a global war not with cannons, but with cargo. They showed the world that in modern war, connection outweighs firepower and speed of production defeats armor. The lesson endures. Empires fall when they cannot match the tempo of steel.